In human history, seemingly minor mistakes and chance events have often redirected the course of nations. A misplaced word, a misread memo, an engineer's shortcut, a clerk's lapse. Today, we will trace several moments where a small error set off consequences far beyond anyone's intention. Consider this a tour through fragile turning points, where the ordinary collided with the unstoppable. Let's turn the clock to the evening of November 8, 1989. In East Berlin, political reform had been inching forward across Eastern Europe. The Cold War was cooling, but slower than people hoped. Günter Schabowski, recently appointed as a kind of unofficial spokesperson for the East German Politburo, sat before a packed press conference. He was there to read out routine updates on citizens' affairs. The mood was tired, the format was predictable. The details were foggy, even to him. On his desk lay a set of notes outlining new travel measures. East Germany was preparing a controlled loosening at one specific checkpoint, a carefully managed opening meant to let people leave the country once they had completed the necessary approvals and paperwork. It was not a wholesale lifting of restrictions. It was not immediate. It was a small bureaucratic valve designed to relieve pressure without blowing up the system. Schabowski, exhausted from endless meetings, read from a vague announcement that he did not fully understand. The briefing trudged along without incident. Then, near the end, an Italian journalist asked a simple, precise question. When does this take effect? Schabowski flipped through his notes. He looked for a line that wasn't there. He hesitated for a heartbeat and gave the answer that changed everything. As far as I know, immediately. That word, immediately, detonated across East Berlin like a signal flare. People poured into the streets and ran for the checkpoints. Border guards tuned to the same press conference assumed a new order had been issued. Because no location had been specified, crowds moved toward every crossing. Confused and afraid to escalate, soldiers began to lift the barriers. People surged through, embraced on the wall, celebrated in the floodlights, chanted for unity, and took hammers to concrete. The world watched a border dissolve, not by a carefully orchestrated plan, but by a stray word in a tired room. Afterward, officials scrambled. East Germany's leadership tried to explain that nothing official had been decided. West German leaders reached for phones. Mikhail Gorbachev was thanked for a decision he had not made. Only later did archives and museums confirm what the night had already revealed. There had been no written instruction to open the entire wall at once. History turned because a spokesman misread the moment. The collapse of the Berlin Wall triggered a chain reaction across the Eastern Bloc, and many argue, hastened the end of the Soviet Union. A symbol intended to last for decades fell faster than anyone imagined, pushed not by tanks, but by syntax. Now jump back half a century to another war and another mistake. In the spring of 1941, the German Navy's Enigma machine, an electromechanical device that encrypted military communications, was still an Allied nightmare. The codes shifted daily. The wiring combinations exploded into astronomical possibilities, and even brilliant minds like Alan Turing struggled against the sheer complexity. Then came an encounter in the North Atlantic near Greenland during an operation in early May. The German submarine U-110 had been hunting British ships. Depth charges and radar forced it to the surface. The crew abandoned ship under fire, and the captain assumed the battered vessel would sink, taking its secrets to the bottom. But German engineering had a different idea. U-110 did not go down immediately. British sailors boarded and found a prize beyond any expectation, a functioning Enigma machine and, more importantly, codebooks and key settings. In one desperate hour of chaos, panic, surrender, gunfire, cold waves, the Allies acquired the keys to read the enemy's mail. The significance was hard to overstate. With the machine and documents in hand, codebreakers at Bletchley Park could validate their methods, test assumptions, and finally crack the evolving ciphers. To protect the windfall, the Royal Navy later scuttled the submarine and carefully hid what had been taken so the Germans would not change their systems. Many operations, convoys, and counterattacks that followed were guided by information gleaned from those decrypts. The shift shortened the war and saved countless lives, and it began because a commander assumed his boat would sink fast enough to cover his tracks. He underestimated the stubborn buoyancy of steel and the speed of his enemy. A simple misjudgment loosened the knot of the most sophisticated code on Earth. Not all world-shaping mistakes were military. Some were born in the laboratory dressed as progress. Consider Thomas Migley Jr., an American engineer and chemist in the early 20th century. He attacked a problem every driver knew: engine knock, the harsh pinging caused by premature fuel detonation that damaged motors and made cars unpleasant to operate. After exploring many compounds, Migley found that adding a lead-based additive to gasoline suppressed knock and improved performance. The result was smoother engines, higher compression, faster cars. Industry adopted the additive and made fortunes. Cities filled with automobiles that ran better than ever. But the small fix carried a large poison. Lead emitted from tailpipes and manufacturing plants invaded the air, the dust, the blood of workers and children. Over time, researchers linked lead exposure to neurological damage, developmental delays, and a host of chronic diseases. As car ownership exploded, so did the burden of exposure. The costs were diffuse and slow, so society barely noticed until the evidence became undeniable. Some studies later argued that the phase-out of leaded gasoline in the late 20th century correlated with declines in violent crime and improvements in cognitive outcomes, suggesting that generational exposure had quietly eroded public health and behavior for decades. The numbers remain debated in detail, but the direction is clear. The anti-knock solution knocked down more than engine noise. Midgley contributed another innovation that seemed benign at first: chlorofluorocarbons for refrigeration. They were stable, non-flammable, and efficient. They also lingered in the atmosphere and destroyed the ozone layer, letting harmful ultraviolet radiation reach the ground. Eventually, nations agreed to phase them out to allow the ozone to recover. Midgley's intentions, like many inventors, were practical. The consequences, however, were planetary. A tweak in chemistry reverberated through ecology and policy for generations. History also turns on miscalculated trust. In the medieval Balkans, a Byzantine ruler waged a relentless campaign of influence and subterfuge against a neighboring power that had struggled to consolidate its identity, what would become Bulgaria. The empire deployed bribes, spies, and informants, threading its networks through courts and villages in an effort to destabilize and dominate. For a time, the strategy worked. Then, an heir to the Bulgarian throne wrote to the emperor with a flattering proposal: a pledge of cooperation and a request for a list of the most reliable Byzantine agents operating in the region, so the two sides could coordinate. Whether out of arrogance, fatigue, or the simple human craving to be believed, the emperor supplied the names. The next day, those spies were reportedly found hanging, the networks cut in a single stroke. In one rash act of faith, the empire crippled its own eyes and ears. The neighbor it tried to weaken survived, organized, and grew more secure. A state that might have remained a shadow acquired definition and durability. All because the wrong letter met the wrong ego. Now return to the beaches of Normandy in June 1944. Among the soldiers, medics, and engineers who assaulted the Atlantic Wall stood a war photographer named Robert Capa. He waded ashore under fire, shooting as he ran, loading and unloading film with wet hands, capturing blurred, urgent frames of men crawling through surf. When he made it back to England, he handed his precious rolls to Life magazine, which had paid dearly for the right to publish them. The negatives were, at that moment, priceless historical evidence. They reached the darkroom. A teenager in the lab, rushing to meet a deadline, placed the films in a drying cabinet. The door was shut, the temperature climbed, the emulsion softened. When the editors opened the dryer, nearly all the frames were warped beyond recognition. 11 images survived, their grain and motion becoming their own language of terror and courage. The world saw the assault through a handful of ghostly pictures, instead of a full record. An error measured in minutes reshaped the visual memory of D-Day for the next 80 years. Finally, consider the quiet labors of a 19th century mathematician named William Shanks. He spent decades computing digits of pi by hand, line after line, page after page, extending the decimal farther than anyone had before. He published the result as a monument to human patience and precision. For a generation, his digits were carved into books and minds. Then, 70 years later, someone checked the work and discovered a single error in the 527th decimal place. Every digit after that was wrong. 10 years of Shanks's calculations had been built on a flawed stepping stone. The lesson is not that diligence is useless. It is that diligence requires verification. One unnoticed slip can propagate for decades, respected and repeated because it looks authoritative. When we line up these stories, a pattern emerges. Most of the people involved were not fools or villains. A spokesman answered a direct question with a careless adverb. A submarine captain followed a standard procedure and guessed wrong about physics and timing. An engineer solved a visible problem and ignored an invisible one. An emperor indulged his pride. A lab assistant hurried. A mathematician trusted his intermediate result. None of them set out to rewrite history, yet their choices did. What can we extract from this? First, systems amplify small inputs. At the Berlin Wall, television, radio, and rumor networks turned a single word into a mass movement in hours. In wartime, complex encryption multiplies the value of a captured device. A misjudged scuttling becomes a strategic windfall. In industrial society, the automobile magnifies any additive you pour into its tank, and refrigerants waft from kitchens to the stratosphere. In empires, one leaked list can collapse an intelligence architecture built by thousands of bribes. In media, a mishandled darkroom door transforms a battlefield's record. In mathematics, one unchecked carry ruins pages of digits. Second, clarity is a duty, not a luxury. If a policy is not ready, say so. If a submarine will not sink at once, assume the enemy will board. If a chemical affects the nervous system, treat the street as a laboratory. If an informant asks for names, suspect the angle. If heat damages film, measure the temperature. If a calculation spans years, arrive the middle steps. The line between catastrophe and competence is often a checklist. Third, humility is protective. The spokesman could have said, "I don't know." The commander could have sent a demolition team. The engineer could have tested long-term exposure in living neighborhoods. The emperor could have asked, "Why would he need the list?" The intern could have asked for help. The mathematician could have invited a colleague to check the middle. Modesty prevents momentum from carrying a mistake forward. And finally, the world is nonlinear. The Berlin Wall did not fall brick by brick through slow negotiation. It fell in an evening because of a contradiction between what people heard and what the system could enforce. The Enigma system did not collapse gradually. It tipped when a door stayed open a little too long. Leaded gasoline was not retired because engines improved. It was driven out by evidence of harm that arrived decades late. Power structures do not always erode from without. Sometimes they are punctured from within. Cultural memory does not always grow richer with more documentation. Sometimes it thins because a single process failed. Mathematical truth is not guaranteed by effort, it is secured by method. So, when you think about the forces that shape history, do not look only at the grand strategies and the big speeches. Scan for the small human factors, the tired reader of a memo, the assumption about how fast metal sinks, the chemical with unintended pathways, the flattered sovereign, the overheated cabinet, the unchecked digit. These are the levers that can move the world when circumstances align. And now the question passes to you. Which other small missteps bent the arc of events? Which overlooked details reshaped a war, a policy, a technology, or a culture? Share the examples you know. The more we study these fractures, the better our odds of catching the next one before it widens into a fault line.